Thank you very much, Mike, and happy Sabbath, everybody. Hymn number 167, God Will See Us Through, I think is the most popular hymn here in Cleveland. It seems like we play it the most. I call it the Mark Graham factor. He would probably argue the other way, but I think that it plays a little bit of a factor into why we play that hymn so much. I hope you all had a nice short work week. This Wednesday, Stephen and I got to get out to a baseball game. I love baseball. It's one of my favorite pastimes. And to quote my favorite movie, Moneyball, how can you not be romantic about baseball? Well, in this case, the weather dropped from 50 to 35, and the Guardians lost 0-8. So it was a rougher outing, but that's baseball in April, so you got to deal with that here. I've been at the same job in the same company for the past 4 years. And in those 4 years, I haven't had a new coworker start that works directly on our team until this last month. And being that it's the spring holiday season, my coworker tends to ask me more questions than other people do about my faith. You know, a lot of people will ask questions, but it's kind of more of a courtesy. He drills down a little bit deeper, which I don't mind. It gives me the opportunity to talk a little bit more about it. And he's been a Christian for a while. He starts off his days, he listens to sermons from some of the big-name televangelists. And you can tell that he has a respect for other people. He has honesty. He has a lot of good in him. So I have no hesitancy explaining to him and talking to him about what these holy days picture and being a little bit more detailed than I would with someone who would passively ask out of courtesy. This holiday season is one for me that I am able to visualize a little bit more than the others. Primarily, the Bible is very clear about the plagues, the Exodus, the crucifixion and the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And also, maybe we get more visuals because it's common with The Prince of Egypt is a very popular movie that gives us some visuals, or just all the artwork around the Lord's Supper and the crucifixion. So I'm not afraid to get a little past the surface level with my coworker, and he was familiar with the Old Testament, the Passover lamb and the Exodus, and he was also familiar with the concept of Christ being the ultimate sacrifice for our sins. But there was one thing that I mentioned to him that he hadn't connected before, and it's something that when it was mentioned to me, I also hadn't connected it before. When God performed the 10 plagues over the land of Egypt, each plague correlated and represented an increasingly important god to the Egyptian people. So I thought if it's something I hadn't taken in before, then maybe it's something we can dig in shallowly a little bit together here. So the stories in Exodus 7 through Exodus 12, although they don't say that they align directly plague for God, Egyptian God, lowercase g, if you go down into Exodus 18, verses 10 to 12, we'll go ahead and turn there. This is a conversation between Moses and his father-in-law, Jethro. Jethro was a Midianite priest, and he gave his daughter to Moses after Moses saved his daughter from the shepherds and saved his flock from the shepherds at the well. After Moses and the Israelites escaped from the Egyptians and crossed the Red Sea, Jethro brought Moses' wife and kids to see him again because Moses had gone back to Egypt to be with his people and left his family with Jethro. So looking at Exodus chapter 18, verse 10, Jethro says, "Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them." Jethro refers to the all-capitalized Lord as greater than all the Egyptian gods, and he said, now I know that God is above all of their gods. Jethro was a Midian priest. He had his own pre-existing beliefs, and being a part of a group of people that descended from Abraham, he knew of the God of Abraham and he knew of his power, but this truly, it took another step forward to cementing that belief and that knowledge with him. So going back to how they tie back to the plagues, I want to be clear that it's pretty easy to tie the 10 plagues back to Egyptian gods, and that's more of a numbers game. Egyptians had, Wikipedia lists 57 major Egyptian gods and 394 minor or lesser known gods. That's a lot, right? If you're trying to tie it to 10, you can make that connection pretty easily. Going down into the first plague, we all understand the first plague of the river turning into blood, but we'll turn there and we'll look at a couple of details that I skim over sometimes when I read it. So the description starts in Exodus chapter 7. Exodus chapter 7 and 14, but I'm going to go ahead and look down a little bit to verse 20. So Exodus chapter 7, verse 20. And Moses and Aaron did so, just as the Lord commanded. So he lifted up the rod and struck the waters that were in the river, in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants. And the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. The fish that were in the river died, the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink the water of the river. So there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. Not only did the water turn to blood, which is kind of the highlight of this plague, but also the fish died, the river stank, and it was undrinkable. This is an attack on the god of the Nile, Hapi, H-A-P-I. Hapi was not only the god of the Nile, but also the god of the flooding of the Nile, the god of the fishes, and the god of fertility. And this makes a lot of sense when you consider what the Nile River was to a desert region like northeastern Africa. Outside of the Nile and its region close to the Mediterranean, the rest of the area of Africa is Sahara Desert. In the desert, there's death, there's no food, there's no water. And the Nile, for the Egyptian people, is the river that brings life and food. And although it's a gift from God, capitalized G, they personify it with one of their lowercase g gods. Now we know that this plague was not enough to prove to Pharaoh that the Lord is more powerful than their gods. So moving down to the 9th plague, we start to read Pharaoh's breaking point in Exodus chapter 10, verse 21. And I'm just going from the 1st to the 9th plague because I'm not going to sit here and just skim over 10 different Egyptian gods and how they tie back. But really, these last 2 plagues are very big name gods in the Egyptian religion. So Exodus chapter 10 and then verse 21. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward the heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, darkness which may even be felt." So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did they rise from his place for 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. The darkness was a plague that directly overpowered the Egyptian god of the sun, Ra. Similar to the Nile, bringing life, food, and fertility, the sun was the thing for the Egyptians that brought light. It brought day, it brought life, and it brought food. Ra in Egyptian lore was considered to be one of the more powerful and original gods. He was believed to be the first Egyptian pharaoh, and in a lot of their accounts, people were created from his sweat and tears. And putting myself into the shoes or the sandals of an Egyptian who lived 4,500 years ago, and reading that they had no real recorded encounters with God until they took the Israelites as slaves, I understand a little bit of what they believed. There were only 2 things that have always been and seem to always be in their culture, and that was the Nile River and the sun. And with no known interaction with God and being able to build a civilization that was able to enslave 600,000 Israelite men, it makes sense in their history that they worshiped the sun and they worshiped the Nile and created their gods to personify them. However, it was clear through this text that the Egyptians got carried away with the power that was Egypt, the power of that state, the power of that territory. And they also got carried away with the power that was their Pharaoh, and we know that God had a plan for them. Moving on to the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. I'm not going to read through this section, but I'll highlight that the death of the firstborn affected every person in Egypt who did not spread the blood of the Passover lamb on the lintel and down the doorposts. That's everybody from Pharaoh's firstborn to the firstborn of the lowest of workers. This is interpreted as an attack on Pharaoh himself. Now, in modern democratic society, we don't really see our leaders as gods. We have dictators who try to control their people and imagine themselves as gods. We have the royal family, but, in the United States, we look at them as people and not as divine powers. But with the prosperity and really the lack of transparency in ancient Egypt, Egyptians saw Pharaoh as their god and as a divine power. Similar to how Ra was thought to be the first Pharaoh of Egypt, this Pharaoh claimed a role of divinity as a protector over the people of Egypt. And the death of specifically his firstborn caused the Egyptians to have more fear than with other plagues as called out in Exodus. In Exodus 12:33, the Egyptians then urged the Israelites to get out of the land because they were afraid of more death. If God is able to kill the firstborn, they thought, their mind spiraled a little bit, and they said, God is able to kill us all. During the spring holiday season, I obviously myself and probably many of you tend to spend more time in the book of Exodus than the rest of the year. In Exodus 13:8, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is instituted, and it says, "You shall tell your son in that day, saying, 'This is because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt. It shall be a sign to you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth, for with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt.'" And as Christians, we remember these days for more than one reason. We remember the Old Testament Passover, the days of unleavened bread. We also remember the New Testament Passover, the sacrifice that Jesus Christ had for us. We also visualize the unleavened bread to represent sinlessness and Jesus Christ being the bread of life, having no sin. However, as believers of both the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and the deliverance out of Egypt, it's a time for us to be able to reflect on the whole history of what God has done for us, of what God and his Son have done for us. And of those incredible things, the overpowering of Pharaoh and the deliverance of the Israelites out of the bondage of Egyptians is one of those things we focus on. Through that overpowering and through the 10 plagues, God showed that there is no other God, lowercase g, before him. And he made it clear to the Israelites that they should believe in no other God before him. Whether it be the God of the Nile, Happy, the God of the sun, Ra, or the belief that Pharaoh is a god himself, we know that the Egyptians and the Israelites saw the power of God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, being more powerful than all of those other gods. And it is something that we will continue to remember and reflect on throughout the spring holiday season.